it's just important to know that just because it's gluten-free doesn't mean that it's really nourishing for your body. Is actually, how do I interpret whether this has gluten in it or not? There's not many things I miss, and that I don't feel like I'm missing out at all. So don't freak out if you're celiac and you're watching this. It's totally fine. You'll be fine. We're gonna sort this out for you.
Yeah, I know I look good. Yeah, I look fly. Baby,
Hello guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'm doing a little bit of a different video. We're going to be talking about celiac disease and gluten. Guys, I just got my fringe, so I apologize. It's going to happen a lot. We're going to talk about celiac disease and gluten intolerance and gluten-free foods because I am celiac and I get asked about it a lot. And I think that a lot of people who are diagnosed with celiac disease don't really know the ins and outs of it. That's because they didn't study nutrition. So you're not meant to know everything. There are some natural misconceptions that are floating around out there. And there's a lot of marketing that is quite frankly creatively dumb. So we're going to get to the bottom of that today. We're going to talk about a few myths. We're going to talk about, if you're celiac, a lot of things that you're going to be hearing that are probably going to be annoying you. We're going to talk about how to order out at a restaurant. We're going to talk about what celiac disease actually is, the symptoms, how you get diagnosed, how I got diagnosed, when I got diagnosed, and pretty much just everything about celiac disease. So let this be your celiac survival guide as you and I'm assuming you have celiac disease, or maybe you're just interested in the topic, but you and I are going to get through this together, okay? It's really not that bad. I know that when you first get diagnosed, you can be like, oh my goodness, I can't eat anything, everything has gluten, this is the end of my life, but I promise you that's not the case, and today we're going to talk about why. It would be silly of me to start this video without outlining what celiac disease actually is. There is celiac disease, there is gluten allergy, there is gluten intolerance, there are people who are by choice gluten-free. They're definitely not all the same thing, and let's talk about why. So first, let's talk about celiac disease. That is the most important thing. So celiac disease is actually an immune condition where that person reacts to whenever they have gluten, which is found in wheat, barley and rye. Over time, this immune reaction can cause inflammation that can damage the small intestine, which in turn can cause a lot of detrimental health impacts. So gluten allergy is also a thing. It means that you maybe come up with the genes when you get tested. So when you get tested for celiac disease, there's a blood test. If you have the genes but you get the biopsy and there's no damage, then your class is gluten allergy. If you just have gluten intolerance, you don't have the genes, you don't have any damage within your small intestine when you have the biopsy. So you are not celiac, which means that you can have gluten. You might just feel unwell after it. But when you are celiac, it is so important and critical that you do not have any gluten. There is no cure. The only way to manage a celiac disease diagnosis is to avoid gluten like the plague. I know that sounds scary. Please don't freak out, and if there is a circumstance where you've accidentally eaten gluten, please do not freak out. We can just do the best that we can. That's all we can do, and that's all that health professionals ask of people with celiac disease. Don't stress yourself out, but you do have to be very vigilant because, like I said, incrementally these little bits of gluten can increase that inflammation, which can increase that damage to our small intestine, which can lead to a whole host of really negative impacts. So how do you get diagnosed with celiac disease? I've kind of touched on this when I didn't mean to. If you have celiac disease or they test you for celiac disease, you have to eat gluten. So if you think that you are allergic to gluten, or you've got celiac disease, you have a gluten intolerance, then please don't stop eating gluten yet, which I know sounds very counterintuitive, but you might run the risk of having a false negative if you're not eating gluten right up until you get tested. So what you would be doing is eating your gluten, booking in and saying to your doctor, I need to get tested for celiac disease. They will do a blood test. Then that blood test will show whether you need to go to the next step. It'll come up with whether you have the genes or not. Sometimes doctors are a little bit hesitant to test for celiac disease. I don't know why. I found that in my case, pretty much had to beg for it. That's fine. And so yeah, that is the case. So if you do have someone in your family who has celiac disease and you start having a few symptoms, I would definitely go and get that checked out. Once you have that blood test that confirms you do have either of those genes, you will then go and get a biopsy of your small intestine, and that will conclusively say whether you have celiac disease or not. I got fully diagnosed in September of 2019. I started the process of finding out if I had celiac disease in March of 2019. So it took quite a while to find out. I had like I almost had a false negative because someone who interpreted the biopsy thought that it wasn't celiac disease, and then another doctor was like, it's 100% celiac disease. So I was not eating much gluten at the time, and I knew that I had to, but it just was so painful for me that I didn't want to. So I wasn't eating gluten very often, and then I went to Cairns with my family and I was like, you know what, I'm just going to eat gluten here, get the test. So I was eating a lot of pasta and stuff, and it was just revolting. Like, I was so bloated, looked like I was pregnant, it was so painful, I felt unwell, it was really messy with my quality of life. I just hated eating gluten. So when I got back and in between that test, I rarely ate any gluten, and I said to my mates at the time, okay, let's go do all the gluten fun stuff, let's go to McDonald's, let's do all that, because if I am celiac, I'm not going to have it again. But it just got to those situations and I was too nervous. And if you've had, like, you know, digestive issues, you know what I'm talking about. I've spoken on my podcast, Real Health Podcast, about how I pooed my pants once driving from Melbourne to my hometown and had to run into a servo. That is what digestive issues do to you. So even though McDonald's can taste good, it's just not really worth it in the long run. Well, I didn't think so anyway. So even with not eating that much gluten before the test, I still got a positive test. And yeah, since then I have not had any gluten. I actually have only had one accidental consumption of gluten. My friend made honey joys, and so they're out of cornflakes, and I didn't think cornflakes, like, I've had cornflakes before that didn't have gluten in it, and I thought they were that brand, but then I realized they were a different brand, so I was like, oh, I'll just check, and then they did have barley in it. So I was like, oh, not good. But I literally only had a tiny bit. So that's pretty much the only close call. That being said, I eat out at restaurants, so we never really know how many close calls I've had, but I haven't had any gluten pains, so that's a pretty good indication for me. What gluten foods do I miss the most? Gluten-containing foods, let's call them, that I miss the most. I find this almost difficult to answer because I don't really feel like I'm missing out on anything. Perhaps because even before I got diagnosed, I wasn't really eating gluten very often. So I'm so used to the substitutes available, and I like to have quite a whole foods diet. So I really don't feel like I'm missing out on anything that much. That being said, I do love hot chips, and a lot of the time they're done in the same fry, which we'll talk about later, which kind of rules it out. So, but I do, whenever I know that they have a gluten-free fry, I always get myself some chips because, yum, why not? I guess in terms of foods that I did eat a lot, I do love bread, but you can have gluten-free bread and I like it just as much. I honestly can't tell the difference anymore. Chicken parmies, same thing. Jordan made one the other night that was awesome, and I just did the breadcrumbs myself from gluten-free bread. Yeah, there's really not many things that I feel like I'm missing out on. Actually, no, there's not many things I miss, and that I don't feel like I'm missing out at all. So don't freak out if you're celiac and you're watching this. It's totally fine. You'll be fine. We're going to sort this out for you. One of my favorite gluten-free snacks. I really love, I'm just going to rattle off a few that are definitely gluten-free, and then we're going to talk about like foods. I'm not going to tell you foods that are like an apple, for example, because obviously we know there's no gluten in that. But I think when people ask this, they're thinking, what are the foods that normally contain gluten, that have gluten removed, that you'd like to eat? And 100% I get it. You kind of like the snack, like junk, I don't like calling it junk food, but junk food category, 100%. I really like the mint slice biscuits. I think that's what they're called, mint slice maybe, or mint chocolate, I don't know. Either from Coles or Woolies. Woolies are probably my favourite. Coles are a little bit more creamy, but I used to love mint slice biscuits, so now I have those. They have a fake Tim Tam, just not the same. I just don't really like it. I did love Tim Tams, but it's not something I really miss because I feel like there's a lot I can have instead. So yeah, if you are celiac or you're gluten-free or you're avoiding gluten for some reason, that's cool. Go to Woolies and get the mint slice bickies, so good. Other things, gluten-free pasta, some are amazing, some aren't so good, and it's not so much the taste, and you'll find this, it's more how things cook and how things react. So you'll find when you start experimenting with gluten-free things that maybe the flour doesn't cook as well, or maybe the pasta doesn't cook as well, or maybe it's chewy, or maybe things are dry. So you just have to kind of play around with the brands that you're going for and looking and looking for. But I guess those are kind of the main things I would say. The gluten-free pasta, I do have not heaps, but I do enjoy it. The mint sliced Vickies I absolutely love. And then everything, I feel like a lot of other snacks that I enjoy are naturally free of gluten, so there's not like any hacks or anything to do there. But yeah, I will definitely start. Oh my god, how did I forget? I tried today, because I knew I was doing this video, I tried the gluten-free Wheat Bix, and I can confirm that they're so delicious. They're very nostalgic. They remind me of when my needy would make them for me. Yeah, so good. I'm a person who used to eat like mushy Wheat Bix, so like the dryness doesn't interest me. So if you're a Wheat Bix person, like if you were pre-celiac, a Wheat Bix person, you'll love them. They're so delicious. Go and get them. And I quite like the ingredients. Yeah, so definitely those are the things that I recommend from the gluten-free section. Okay, so one thing that can be really confusing for people who get diagnosed with celiac disease is actually, how do I interpret whether this has gluten in it or not? The first thing to know is that gluten is present in barley, wheat and rye. So if you see anything that contains barley, wheat or rye, throw it in the bin. Don't throw it in the bin, just don't buy it, just don't eat it. We do not need to be consuming barley, wheat or rye because that has gluten. So just get that in your head. Barley, wheat, rye has gluten. So the first thing you want to do is make sure that it doesn't have barley, wheat or rye. Now, if you're buying a product that just says gluten-free on the packet, you can be completely confident that that has no gluten in it. The reason being that because of the regulations, like the food regulations for Australia, for something to say gluten-free, it has to be made in a factory where there's no gluten present. Also in the nutrition paneling, if it has that gluten-free label, it will have on the back under protein, because gluten is a protein. I actually didn't talk about what gluten was. Gluten is a protein. Under protein section, it will say gluten, and then in levels, it'll say nil, or 0, 0, or not detected, not detected. Then you can be 100% certain that that has no gluten in it. That's when you can be completely safe. So big tick on things that say gluten-free, big tick on things that have it on the nutritional paneling, and they definitely should. If you read something, you think it says gluten-free, and then you turn it over and it doesn't have the information on the nutritional paneling, so it doesn't have gluten nil, then make sure it says gluten-free, because I can tell you a lot of times I've gone to pick up something that says guilt-free and I'm like, what the hell? What does guilt-free even mean? Like, it annoys me. It annoys me that they're preying on people who feel guilty from eating, but it can look like gluten-free. It's happened a few times. I've never eaten it and I've never bought it, but it's just caught my eye. I'm like, oh, gluten-free. And I'm like, no, guilt-free. So just be careful. So it's always good to have that little check on the back of the nutritional paneling. If there's something that's not labeled gluten-free, does it mean you can't eat it? Absolutely not. You know, some celiacs might say yes, and to them I say, how do you do that? Because that would be incredibly restrictive in terms of things that you can purchase, or you probably wouldn't eat at a restaurant. No, you wouldn't, because of the contamination. So it essentially means that it doesn't necessarily contain gluten. It just hasn't been made in a factory that doesn't have any gluten present. So just turn it around on the back, and that's when you want to read the ingredients. And yeah, like I said, look out for anything that's barley, wheat or rye. Just be careful. Sometimes it can, if there's a lot, you might miss it. Sometimes it's like syrup, blah, 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 from wheat. So yeah, just really important to read the ingredients. So if it doesn't have the gluten-free label on it, you can still have it as long as you check that it doesn't have any of the gluten-containing ingredients on the nutritional paneling, in the ingredients list, sorry. And I think that's the tricky part, because people are just looking for things that say either has gluten or does not have gluten. It will not on the product say, I contain gluten, and it won't in the ingredients list say gluten. The may contain section, another bit of a funny one there. That just means it's been made in a factory with gluten. It doesn't necessarily mean that it has been touched with gluten. That's just what it means. And honestly, if you don't have anything that has the may contain gluten on it, then it is very restrictive, and you wouldn't eat at any restaurants, because unless it was a restaurant that is completely gluten-free, which we'll talk about soon. I know some in the Geelong, Melbourne area. I'm sorry if you're not from Melbourne or Geelong, and you're looking for these places. But yeah, maybe if you are watching this as a celiac or a gluten-free person, comment below where you are and then some of your favourite places. So like where you're based, so I can cover Geelong and Victoria. That's pretty much it. And where was I going? Oh yeah, so if you were excluding those places, if you were just doing the may contain section and you were not eating it because of that, then you wouldn't eat at a restaurant, because they contain, like, in the premises, gluten. So sometimes you go to a restaurant and you'll say, I'm celiac, and they'll say, oh, sorry, like, we can't cater to celiacs because there's gluten in the kitchen. So that you need to say, oh, okay, 100% understand. Is there a protocol for that? Can you put on some gloves? Can you clean the area? Just let them know that you acknowledge that there's gluten in the restaurant. They're not expecting them to throw out all of their gluten. You just want them to be extra careful and make sure that there's no contamination. And if they can't do it, then just go away. Don't go to that restaurant. I do want to quickly point out here that when we're talking about gluten-free foods and gluten-free snacks and labeling and things like that, gluten-free doesn't necessarily mean it's nutritionally dense. It does not. And sometimes it's quite frustrating because sometimes celiac can get painted with the brush of like, oh, I'm just trying to be healthy and eat gluten-free. Like, that's so fine if you genuinely for your health don't want to eat gluten. But sometimes when I go out for dinner and I say, oh, I need that gluten-free, they'll be like, is that preference or allergy? And I'm like, allergy, which, you know, it's totally fine if it's just preference, but it doesn't mean that it's necessarily healthy. And there's plenty of foods like those mint-sized biscuits, they're nutritionally dense. Absolutely not. They're full of sugar, but I love them. So it's just important to know that just because it's gluten-free doesn't mean that it's really nourishing for your body. Okay, they are not synonymous with each other, so you need to still be considering your nutrients. Okay, when you're gluten-free, it doesn't mean that you're naturally eating a really healthy diet. Okay, let's talk about eating out, because I think that this is probably one of the most daunting things for new celiacs. One of the big things is that you don't want to be a pain, you don't want to be a nuisance, you're with a group of friends, you don't want to make a big deal out of it. Well, you know what I say to that? Stuff that. Because you have a disease, girlfriend, and you can pull that, or boyfriend, or my friend, you can pull that card, because it's true. And you will feel, you know, some people don't feel sick, but I do. I will feel really, really sick. I could end up in the ER from pain and discomfort and pooing a lot and spewing a lot. So yeah, I'm going to be pretty diligent about how I speak to my wait staff. Now, on that thread, you should never be rude. You should never be condescending, and you should never treat them like they're stupid and they might not understand what celiac disease is. That is not their fault. That is not their fault, and it is not your job to be rude to them. There is nothing wrong with that wait staff, and you should treat every single wait person like a legend, because I work in hospitality and it's a hard industry to work in. So yeah, definitely by no stretch of the imagination be rude, but make sure that you're very, very clear and that you're very diligent with the questions that you ask. A great tip for eating out is checking the menu in advance to see if they have gluten-free options. It just makes it a little bit easier. There have been a few times I've gone out with friends and ended up eating a bowl of steamed vegetables, which I do love vegetables, but that's not really what I want when I go out for dinner. A very, very, very important thing to do is to ask if they have a gluten-free fryer. So sometimes they'll have a restaurant on their menu, spring rolls gluten-free or chips gluten-free, and like, yes, those foods don't actually contain gluten, but unless they have a designated gluten-free fryer, you're putting that gluten-free food in a bath of other gluten. So it's kind of counterintuitive, counterproductive, and you need to make sure that they have the same fryer. So if you just asked, are the chips gluten-free, someone who doesn't actually know that technically to be gluten-free it has to have its own fryer, they might say, yeah, the chips are gluten-free, because they're just thinking, yeah, it says it on the menu, and I don't think potato has gluten, and that's all the chips are. You need to actually explicitly ask, do you have a gluten-free fryer? And if they say, I don't know, you need to say, could you please check? And you don't need to be rude, like I said, but that you need to check. And if they come back and they say no, or if they say yes, you need to just make sure that they actually checked. You know, watch them go back to the kitchen, make sure they actually check. So they come out and they say no, we don't have a gluten-free fryer, then consider anything that's fried containing gluten. Okay, it's no longer gluten-free. Take that off your menu. Take that off your options. I know that sucks, but that's just the truth. You should not be eating things that have been in a gluten-free fryer, because it's pretty much rolling gluten all over them. So, in a gluten fryer, with gluten foods, it's just like rolling gluten all over them. So you need to make sure that you ask every single time when you go out, if you're having a food that is going to be fried, even if it says gluten-free, to say, hi, do you have a gluten-free fryer? Best question. My boyfriend is trained really well in the gluten-free, so I don't mean to say that in like a dominating way, but like well trained in the gluten space, knowledgeable. Let's just say he's knowledgeable in the gluten space rather than well trained, and he always asks that question. It's a great question to ask, and it will get you a lot of answers, and it will either give you a lot of options for your choice or take away a lot, which is sometimes a good thing as well. Next thing to talk about when eating out at a restaurant is to always tell them that you have celiac disease. So it doesn't matter, like, you're not going to look like a wanker, and maybe if you do look like a wanker or people perceive you as a wanker, I wouldn't, then that's on them, it's not on you. So you need to tell them, because you want them to take that extra care. You want them to know it's not just a preference. You want them to know it's not just allergy. You want them to know that this is an immune condition. This is celiac disease that we're talking about. and they need to take it seriously. Like I said before, do not be afraid to go and ask them to go and ask the chef. The chef, I guess it depends where you go. Where I worked, he was awesome. He knew about gluten. He would always say, he would actually always say to me, there's so many people, when it was preference, they would say that it was allergy, and then when they said they don't have a gluten-free fry, they'd be like, oh no, actually it's fine. So you get people like that as well. But you need to know, the chef does need to know about these things, and they often do. So if the waitress or the waiter or the wait person does not have knowledge around this or doesn't know, don't be afraid to say, oh, that's awesome, could you please go and check? And if they're not going to check and they just look like if they say, do you have a gluten-free fry? And they're like, yeah. Go, walk away, because they don't really care and they're not going to ask. So yeah. If they don't know, don't order, and probably just leave. Don't be afraid to leave. Do not be afraid to leave a restaurant. This is like, it's not 10 years ago, 20 years ago when celiac disease was this obscure thing. People know about it. People know about celiac disease and gluten allergy. So if they're not taking it seriously, then they're just going to be losing business. And there is no problem if you've sat down, you look at the menu and there's nothing that you can have, and you know that they're not being diligent with their gluten contamination, then there's absolutely no shame in leaving. And that's not being rude. That's just putting your health first, because this is serious and we need to take it seriously. My favourite gluten-free, designated gluten-free areas to eat, there is a fish and chip shop in Geelong called King George Fish and Grill. They are super diligent with their gluten. They put the stickers on there, they put it on like all of the dockets so you know. And yeah, no, they have a gluten-free fryer. They're really great with contamination. So that's one place. There's Gluten Free for You, which is in Geelong. I've had a few things from there and that's completely gluten-free. I love that. In Ivanhoe, there is Theo's Fish and Chips, and they're completely gluten-free, which is awesome. And my favourite one is in Ivanhoe as well, which is Cafe Strata. They're completely gluten-free. They have so many options and it is delicious. So if you are in Melbourne, Ivanhoe area, or in Geelong, definitely pass through those places. So yum. Let's go through a few things that you will probably hear people say over the time of being a celiac diseased person. Oh, okay, you've got celiac disease. But what happens if you eat gluten? Like, it's not anaphylactic or anything serious, is it? Like, fair, it's not anaphylactic, but it could make me infertile or make me malnourished due to the lack of absorption from the inflammatory damage to my small intestine. Another thing that really grinds my gears is when people suggest I just have a cheat day and eat a little bit of gluten. This one I find really frustrating because I hate when people are talking about something they obviously don't know about. I've had it a few times. It's like, oh, celiac disease. Yeah, I know someone who had that and they just ate a lot of gluten. Like, they kept on pushing through it and now they're not intolerant to it. That is very untrue. That is extremely very untrue. You're lying to me right now. The bottom line, guys, is to make sure that you're comfortable with every single situation that you are in, and if you are not, you don't have to eat, you can leave. And if somebody is making you feel like you're being a pain or difficult, then stuff them, because they don't have celiac disease and you do. So I also don't want to come across like I'm saying that we're all doomed for it and everyone should feel sorry for us having celiac disease. Not at all. And I recognize my privilege. I'm an able-bodied woman. I don't have another disease. It's just celiac disease, so I know I'm very lucky. This is not a massive deal. Like I said, you can learn to live with it, and I actually don't miss anything. So I'm not saying it's the worst thing in the world and people should feel sorry for me. I know that there are diseases out there that people die from. Okay, so I know what we're dealing with here, but it is serious. This in the same notion, it's very serious, and we can become extremely unwell and have a whole host of things become wrong with us if we do eat gluten. Anyway, guys, that wraps up this video. Thank you so much for watching. I can't wait to do more sit down and chat videos. Make sure you subscribe and put your notifications on so you know when I am posting. And if you'd like to catch me anywhere else, I have my podcast Instagram, and my own Instagram as well. So if you do have any questions, you want to dive deeper, just shoot me a DM, because I have no issues catching up with you in the DMs and we can discuss that. I know that it can be really daunting, so I'm sending my love and just try to take every day as it comes. And yeah, just know that you can get to a point where you don't miss anything. Thank you so much, guys. I'll see you in my next video.
Yeah, I know I look